On July 6, 1943, high above the rolling fields and scattered forests west of Belgorod, the sky looked calm for exactly 7 seconds. A thin haze floated over the horizon, softening the edges of distant clouds. The sun had already climbed well above the eastern tree line, turning dew on wheat stalks into a shimmering sheet of light. On the ground, artillery thunder rolled and echoed like an endless storm, but at altitude, the sounds rose only as a muted tremor beneath the steady hum of engines. For a brief, fragile moment, it seemed that the morning might pass as countless others had during that summer on the Eastern Front. Then black specks appeared on the northern edge of the sky and began to grow. What followed in the next 12 minutes will become a story told in stunned tones in American briefing rooms years after the war. A story about a Soviet pilot who fought with such precision, speed, and ferocity that even hardened U.S. combat veterans would later admit they had never seen anything like it. The man at the center of it was Captain Alexei Morozov of the Soviet Air Force, a squadron leader flying a Yak-9D assigned to cover the left flank of a massive Red Army offensive near Prokhorovka. He was 26 years old, with nearly 300 sorties behind him, a face prematurely aged by cold wind and oxygen-starved altitudes, and a flying style that combined strict discipline with a sudden, almost explosive aggression when the moment demanded it. In the Soviet records, he would be listed by rank, unit, and number of victories. For the American pilots who later heard the full account, he would be remembered simply as the man who turned 12 minutes of sky into a storm. The morning had begun with orders that sounded routine for that phase of the campaign. German armored formations were concentrating for counterattacks. Soviet ground units needed cover. Fighter patrols would fan out ahead of the advancing tank corps, sweeping for German bombers and interceptors. In practice, nothing about that day was routine. The Battle of Kursk had already devoured thousands of men and machines. Every flight took place above a battlefield so vast and violent that the earth itself seemed to bleed smoke. Alexei's Yak lifted off from a dusty forward strip shortly after 8 o'clock. His aircraft climbed through layers of haze, its Klimov engine pulling steadily as the altimeter needle began to sweep upward. Behind him, 3 other Yaks of his flight followed in staggered formation. They leveled off at around 3,500 meters, forming a shallow arc that stretched across the sky like a drawn bow. Below them, columns of Soviet armor crawled forward, their steel hulls reflecting patches of light through the drifting smoke. Above them, somewhere between the clear air and the thin cloud bands, German fighters watched and waited. Alexei knew they were there. He had flown against them too many times not to feel their presence. A kind of intuition developed over dozens of engagements, a tightening in the muscles at the base of the neck, a subtle shift in the way the sky looked at the edges of his vision. German pilots preferred to attack from above and behind, using altitude and sun glare as weapons. They would circle, choose their moment, then dive in tight, fast passes that tore formations apart before pulling back up into the safer upper air. The Soviet answer to that tactic was simple: climb anyway, accept the disadvantage, and trust aggression over caution. That morning, Alexei's orders were to protect a wedge of advancing armor and to prevent German fighters from breaking through to the attack corridors. But like every experienced pilot on the Eastern Front, he understood that written orders rarely survived first contact with incoming Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. At 8:27, the radio reports began to filter through the network of controllers and observers. German formations sighted north of Belgorod, bombers massing beyond the horizon, fighters at altitude. The sky would not remain quiet for long. Far to the west, American pilots flew their own missions over another front in another part of the war. Some escorted bombers over France. Others attacked shipping in the Mediterranean. They knew the Luftwaffe as a ruthless, skilled opponent. They had seen Me-109s carve through defenseless aircraft FW-190s slam into bomber formations with terrifying ferocity. They understood German discipline, German aircraft performance, German doctrine. What they did not yet fully grasp was how a Soviet pilot, flying a Yak that many Western analysts considered inferior in certain respects, could turn a short engagement into a demonstration of absolute dominance. That understanding would come later, in briefing rooms where captured records, shared reports, and post-war interviews converged into a single, almost unbelievable narrative. On that July morning, none of that had been written yet. There was only the vast, pale sky and the distant specks that grew larger with every passing second. Alexei saw them first as faint dots high above his left wing. He knew immediately they were not his own. The formation was too tight, the pattern too clean. German fighters. They held the altitude advantage, just as doctrine demanded. They approached in a measured, controlled line, using the sun to mask their descent. To an inexperienced eye, the sky still looked calm. To a veteran, it was a chessboard on the verge of exploding into motion. The German commander above likely saw the Yaks as routine targets, Soviet escort fighters guarding ground units below. He had faced similar formations dozens of times. The pattern was familiar. Dive, strike, climb, repeat. The advantage lay with him. At least, that was what the equations of altitude and energy suggested. The equations did not include Alexei's peculiar sense of timing. Over months of brutal air combat, he had developed a way of reading the sky that went beyond instruction. He could sense when an enemy formation committed to a dive not only by position, but by rhythm, the subtle moment when their line of movement changed from probing to attacking. He waited for that moment now, his eyes fixed not on individual fighters, but on the overall arc of their approach. Seconds stretched. The altimeter held steady. The Yaks flew apparently unaware, maintaining their protective sweep over the Soviet armor below. Then it happened. The German formation compressed. The distance between fighters narrowed. Their line shifted from lateral movement to a downward vector. The attack had begun. In most engagements, Soviet pilots in such a position would try to break formation, scatter, and force the Germans to choose dispersed targets. But Alexei chose something different. Instead of pulling away, he tightened the formation, giving his wingmen a clear, stable reference in the sky. He began a shallow climb, not enough to meet the Germans head-on, but enough to alter the geometry of their dive. His aircraft rose into a position that turned their advantage into a narrow corridor of approach. They were still above him. They still owned the initial move. But he had drawn them onto a line where his own turn radius and fire angle would intersect their path at exactly the right moment. What followed over the next 12 minutes would later be broken down into diagrams, angles, and timing calculations. Analysts would trace it second by second, noting how each energy trade, each turn, each burst of fire led into the next. But in the moment, it unfolded like a single, continuous motion, part instinct, part memory, part hard-earned courage. The first Messerschmitt dove tore the Yaks with the confidence of a hunter moving in for the kill. The others followed in staggered intervals, creating a chain of descending fighters aimed at tearing open the Soviet formation and breaking through to the bomb-run corridor beyond. They expected the typical response: defensive maneuvers, desperate evasive turns, scattered targets. Instead, they watched the lead Yak climb slightly, then roll in a way that turned its fuselage into a narrow, rising blade cutting into their dive path. The American pilots who would later see this sequence on reconstructed diagrams stopped, stared, and replayed it mentally. They were used to aggressive moves. They were familiar with bold risks. But the way Alexei positioned his Yak in those first seconds was something else entirely. It was not reckless. It was not random. It was precise. It was the opening step of a sequence that would leave 7 German fighters falling from the sky in a span of time shorter than a quarter of an hour. On the ground, Soviet tank crews advancing beneath the engagement saw only fleeting shadows cutting across the sun and the occasional distant flash as cannon fire erupted far above them. For them, the battle was a silent ballet of silhouettes. For Alexei, it was a rapidly tightening spiral in which every choice he made would determine whether his flight survived at all. He had been in many fights where the enemy held the advantage. He had lost friends to unseen dives and surprise attacks. He knew the taste of helplessness when another pilot controlled the vertical axis of battle. That would not happen today. The first German fighter committed fully to the dive, nose down, guns ready. In that instant, the roles shifted. Alexei, still apparently below and vulnerable, had already begun turning that commitment into the German pilot's greatest mistake. The clock on the Yak's instrument panel ticked forward. The 12 minutes that would be studied and retold again and again had just begun. The first Messerschmitt swept downward with a confidence born from years of tactical doctrine. German pilots on the Eastern Front had perfected the art of the high-speed diving attack. Strike fast from above, deliver a crippling blow, then climb back into the unreachable safety of altitude. For them, combat was a set of geometric advantages: altitude, speed, sun position, surprise. They believed in those advantages as firmly as they believed in the steel around them. And on most days, they were right. But not on this one. As the lead Mi-109 shot downward, Alexei's Yak-9D completed its shallow climb and rolled into a tight bank that placed him at the precise intersection of the Germans' dive path. The maneuver was so sudden, so sharply angled, that even the Soviet pilots behind him momentarily lost visual contact with their commander. The Yak's dark green fuselage cut across the sky like a scythe. In that moment, the German pilot believed he still controlled the engagement. He saw a Soviet fighter rising into his dive, a predictable, easily defeated target. But Alexei's move was not defensive. It was a trap. The Yak's sudden roll brought its nose into an upward diagonal line that intersected with the descending Messerschmitt's forward arc. For a fraction of a second, the two aircraft hurtled toward each other in a geometry that should have favored the attacker. Yet in that fragile window of alignment, Alexei pushed forward, allowing the Yak's nose to settle into a rising shot that no doctrine had trained the German pilot to expect. The Yak's 20mm cannon fired in a single, disciplined burst. Bright streaks cut into the sky. One round struck the underside of the Messerschmitt's engine cowling. Another tore through the left wing root. The German fighter jerked violently, smoke trailing from its crippled engine. It tumbled in a spiraling fall, losing lift almost instantly. Within seconds, it vanished beneath the lowest layer of haze, a thin black streak marking its descent. Alexei didn't watch it fall. His attention was already on the second fighter diving in behind the first. This was where the tension shifted. The engagement that many pilots would later describe as the impossible 12 minutes was not a simple chain of individualized duels. It was a cascade, each enemy fighter diving along a pre-planned attack corridor, each believing the Yak formation would break apart. Instead, they flew directly into a pattern that Alexei had anticipated long before they committed. The second Messerschmitt came down at a steeper angle, hoping to catch the Yak leader during recovery. Alexei inverted the Yak in a smooth, fluid motion, using the momentum of his previous climb to roll beneath the attacker's path. The Yak's engine roared as he pulled into a tight upward spiral. For an instant, the German pilot lost visual contact with his target, a fatal error in a vertical engagement. Alexei emerged into the German's blind spot. The Yak leveled for a half second, just long enough for another disciplined cannon burst. This one struck the Mi-109's radiator housing. A white spray of coolant erupted into the air like a brief, ghostly plume, trailing behind the fighter as it began to lose power. The German pilot attempted to pull up, but the aircraft stalled into a slow, helpless fall. Then it slipped sideways into a corkscrew motion, its engine coughing, its fate sealed. That was kill number 2. But victory did not bring relief. It brought escalation. Above the unfolding fight, 5 remaining German fighters realized they were now diving into a sky controlled not by a defensive Soviet patrol, but by a pilot exploiting every angle of their approach. They shifted formation, abandoning the rigid attack corridor to spread out and strike from multiple directions. The dive became a chaotic fan of descending aircraft, exactly the situation that overwhelmed most Soviet patrols. It should have overwhelmed Alexei. Instead, it triggered the next phase of his response. He pulled the Yak into a steep climb. It was a dangerous move. Climbing beneath attackers increased the risk of being struck from any angle. But it also reset the engagement's geometry, forcing the Germans to overshoot if their angles were even slightly misjudged. The next German pilot chose a high-speed pass from the right. He came in fast, using the sun's glare to mask his approach. The move would have shattered a less experienced pilot. But Alexei sensed the incoming attack before the Mi-109 became fully visible. He snapped the Yak into a sudden descending turn, letting the fighter streak past his right wing so close that its engine noise boomed across the Yak's canopy. The German overshot, too fast, too low, too committed. Alexei pulled up sharply and fired short burst. A line of cannon shells struck the Messerschmitt's fuselage and tail assembly. The aircraft lurched, trailing dark smoke, and dipped into a fatal descent. Its silhouette twisted as it fell, shrinking against the wide blue emptiness. That was kill number 3. But the sky offered no time to breathe, no time to reflect, no time to feel triumph. The 4th German fighter was already diving from above, while the 2 remaining fighters circled higher, preparing to drop in at angles designed to overwhelm any evasive maneuver. This was the moment in which most pilots transitioned from calculation to desperation. Alexei did the opposite. He embraced the chaos. Instead of evading, he pushed the Yak downward. The aircraft dropped into a steep dive directly beneath the approaching Mi-109. The sudden acceleration strained his harness and pulled blood toward his feet. The Yak bucked from turbulence, the engine howling in protest. But the German pilot, expecting a lateral evasion, found himself chasing a target that momentarily vanished beneath him. Alexei pulled into a vertical climbing roll, an unconventional maneuver that clawed back altitude while reversing direction. The Yak curved upward, arcing behind the diving German. For a moment, the 2 aircraft were aligned along the same descending vector, one behind the other. Alexei fired another burst. The shell struck the Mi-109's right wing, ripping through metal and fuel lines. The fighter caught fire almost instantly, flames erupting along the trailing edge. It spiraled away, a burning streak descending through the hazy sky. That was kill number 4. By now, the American pilots who would later study this engagement described this middle segment as the point where the story becomes hard to believe. 4 enemy fighters downed in barely 5 minutes. With each kill, Alexei's energy state, his altitude, his airspeed, his climb angles should have deteriorated. But every maneuver he chose reclaimed efficiency at the last possible moment. His flying created a pattern that was almost musical in its rhythm. Climb, roll, dive, reverse, ascend. Now came the brief, fragile moment of calm, the eye of the storm. For a few seconds, the sky held an eerie stillness. The remaining German fighters circled high above, realizing that diving individually would only feed into the pattern that had destroyed their comrades. They needed to coordinate to attack simultaneously. Alexei used the moment to climb again, regaining altitude that he had willingly sacrificed. The Yak's engine strained, vibrating through the control column. He felt the familiar tightening in his lungs from the thin air. Sweat stung his eyes. The physical toll was immense. But the Yak kept climbing, its wings cutting upward through a sky that had become a battlefield in motion. Then the final trio of German fighters committed. 3 aircraft diving from 3 directions. This was the breaking point, the moment designed to overwhelm even the most skilled pilot. 3 angles of fire, 3 closing vectors, 3 separate threats converging on a single point. American airmen would later call this the impossible geometry. And it was here, in this collapsing triangle of steel and sky, that Alexei prepared the maneuver that would define the last minutes of the 12. He didn't run. He didn't evade. He rose. The Yak climbed directly into the converging vectors. It was a move so counterintuitive, so extreme, that even seasoned American pilots who reconstructed it decades later admitted they had never seen anything like it. Alexei was outnumbered, outgunned, and nearly out of altitude. But he was about to turn the attack of 3 German fighters into his greatest moment. The tension tightened. The angles closed. The sky compressed into a single point. And the remaining 8 minutes of the engagement were about to begin. The 3 German fighters dropped from the upper atmosphere like spears thrown from the hand of the same giant. Their engines wailed through the thinning air, propellers biting into the cold sky as they accelerated toward a single converging point. Alexei's Yak-9D. Their formation was not random. It was deliberate, refined, and lethal. One descended directly above, using the sun as a blinding halo behind his canopy. Another attacked from the right, drifting slightly downward to cut off any escape to the east. The third spiraled in from the left, closing the noose with a slow, predatory roll. 3 directions, 3 firing arcs, 3 lines that converged into one trap. This was where most pilots died. Even seasoned aces avoided such situations, knowing that geometry, not courage, usually decided the outcome. A single mistake, a single moment of hesitation or miscalculation would be fatal. But Alexei understood something the others did not. He recognized the rhythm of their descent, the spacing of their angles, the way their shadows fell across the cloud layer below him. He sensed hesitation from above, overconfidence from the right, and a slight misalignment from the left. He saw the trap and the opening buried inside it. Instead of diving out of the convergence, he accelerated into it. The Yak's nose lifted a few degrees, enough to gain an upward vector without destroying the momentum required to slip into the gaps between the German approaches. He tightened his harness and pulled back on the control column just enough to feel the Yak shudder, warning him that the air was thinning and the margin for error shrinking. The German pilot, descending from above, fired first. Tracer lines streaked downward, bright threads etched into the sky. They passed within meters of the Yak's tail, close enough that Alexei felt the air vibrate behind him. But Alexei had already shifted his climb angle by a fraction, letting the tracers slip harmlessly aside. Then came the second attack from the right. The Mi-109 cut in sharply, angling for a shot that would intersect with Alexei's climb path within seconds. The fighter's silhouette grew larger, an angular shape with a gleaming canopy reflecting the distant sun. Alexei rolled the Yak to the left, forcing the German to overshoot. The roll was not graceful. It was sharp, brutal, executed at the extreme limit of the Yak's structural tolerance. The aircraft groaned under the sudden lateral stress, its wings flexing as it carved a tight arc. But the maneuver disrupted the attack pattern, forcing the second German fighter to accelerate out of its firing window. 2 down, 1 to go. The third German fighter, the one spiraling in from the left, adjusted instantly. The pilot tightened his roll, pulled into a steeper dive, and positioned himself to intercept Alexei at the base of the Yak's climb. It was a clever move, one born of discipline and experience. The Mi-109 curved through the sky with the precision of a blade, its descent perfectly timed to cut across the Yak's path. For a heartbeat, the 2 aircraft rushed toward each other, one rising, one falling, their trajectories converging at a deadly angle. Any ordinary pilot would have banked out of fear or rolled out of instinct. But Alexei held steady, his gaze fixed not on the attacking fighter, but on the thin wedge of sky just behind its nose. A space barely wide enough for a Yak-9 to slip through. He tightened his grip on the control column. The Yak trembled. The engine roared. The air thinned further, reducing lift, dulling control response. Yet Alexei pushed forward, committing fully to a maneuver few pilots dared attempt. A vertical threading of the needle between two converging firing arcs. The Mi-109 fired. The tracers passed so close that they lit the interior of Alexei's canopy with flashes of orange. One round struck the Yak's right wingtip, tearing a small shard of metal loose. The damage was minor, but the warning was clear. Alexei refused to brake. He pitched the Yak upward at the last possible moment, passing beneath the German fighter's nose, slipping into the sliver of sky he had calculated only seconds earlier. The Yak shot through the narrow gap like an arrow released from a bow. The German pilot, unable to correct in time, overshot the Yak entirely, losing his advantage. Alexei inverted the Yak into a downward arc. His engine groaned under the strain, the propeller slicing through cold air as he leveled the aircraft. The German fighter that had spiraled in now sat exposed beneath him. With unwavering precision, Alexei aligned the Yak's nose and released a short, focused burst. The cannon rounds struck the Mi-109's fuselage just behind the cockpit. A plume of white smoke erupted, followed by a sudden spray of debris that trailed behind the fighter as it spiraled downward. The aircraft dipped into a violent roll, losing altitude rapidly until it disappeared into a faint cloud layer. That was kill number 5. But the sky did not grow any quieter. Instead, it shifted again, as if inhaling before the next storm. The two remaining German fighters had seen everything, and fear crept into the precision of their movements. They no longer attacked with the rigid discipline of the earlier formation. Their strikes were cautious now, hesitant. They circled at a distance, climbing to reclaim altitude and rethinking the engagement. For a moment, a thin calm settled across the sky. The engines hummed in the vast, empty space above the clouds. The wind stretched across the Yak's canopy like a soft, distant whisper. Alexei used this breath of stillness to assess his aircraft. The right wing showed a shallow tear from the earlier strike. The engine temperature was climbing dangerously. The fuel gauge hovered near the lower line. His ammunition, though still sufficient, had dwindled significantly. The battle was turning into a test, not just of skill, but of endurance. Yet far below, Soviet ground forces depended on him. They had radioed earlier that a German air attack threatened to break through their southern flank. If these German pilots succeeded in clearing the sky, columns of enemy armor would advance across an undefended sector. Every second Alexei held them back mattered. Every kill bought another minute for the men on the ground. The remaining German fighters regrouped at a higher altitude. They climbed with a wary, almost fearful deliberation, positioned on opposite sides of the sky, as if unsure whether they faced a single pilot or something else entirely. Their caution, however, concealed a new plan, a pincer attack performed not simultaneously but in timed succession, designed to trap Alexei in the aftermath of the first strike. When the next attack came, it came without warning. One of the German fighters dove sharply from an impossibly steep angle, using the sun's glare to mask its descent. It approached rapidly, closing the distance with terrifying speed. But the attack was not intended to finish the fight. It was designed to force Alexei into an evasive maneuver that would expose him to the second fighter's follow-up attack. A clever tactic, coordinated, precise. But Alexei saw it. He felt it. The first German fighter roared past him, leaving a turbulence wake that shook the Yak violently. The sudden disruption pushed Alexei lower, exactly as the Germans wanted. Below him, the second Mi-109 maneuvered into position, preparing to deliver the strike that would end the fight. But Alexei did something no German pilot expected. Instead of climbing back into the safe path away from the ambush, he dove beneath it. The yak plunged downward, slicing through the lower layer of air like a knife cutting through cloth. The sudden acceleration pushed Alexei firmly against his harness. His vision dimmed for a moment. The world tightened into a narrow tunnel of focus. But the dive allowed him to bypass both firing arcs at once. The Germans reacted too late. Alexei pulled the yak into a high-G climbing turn. The aircraft strained. The horizon spun. The sky compressed into a tight blue ring encircling the canopy. His heart thudded against his ribs. Sweat dripped from his brow. But when he completed the turn, he found himself behind the German fighter that had attempted the finishing strike. The moment tightened like a bowstring. He steadied the yak's nose. A burst of cannon fire erupted from his wing. The shells tore through the German fighter's fuselage, snapping part of the tail assembly. The Mi-109 rolled into a spiraling descent before vanishing beneath the cloud layer. Kill number 6. But there was no triumph, no relief. The final German pilot, witnessing the destruction of 6 aircraft in mere minutes, broke formation and fled toward friendly territory. His retreat signaled the breaking point of the engagement, the collapse of an entire attacking force, undone by a single pilot whose endurance and precision defied the limits of aircraft, altitude, and human physiology. Alexei angled the yak toward the fleeing fighter. He was not finished. The battle had one more minute left. One more kill. One final rise before the fall. The last German fighter fled toward the western horizon, its engine straining as it climbed in a desperate attempt to escape the chaos that had consumed its squadron. Moments earlier, the pilot had attacked with the certainty of victory, believing the numerical advantage and altitude superiority guaranteed success. Now he fled alone through a sky littered with the fading smoke trails of his fallen comrades. The sun reflected off his canopy in a pale shimmer, a fading spark upon the endless blue. Alexei steadied his breathing and angled the Yak-9 into pursuit. The familiar vibration of the engine pulsed beneath him. The aircraft was no longer fresh. Its frame trembled at high speed. The earlier tears in the wingtip fluttered like a small flag in the slipstream, creating a faint rhythmic tapping against the air. The engine temperature hovered near its limit. The aircraft had been pushed to extremes, far beyond what designers in wartime factories had intended. But Alexei did not hesitate. Exhaustion pressed against him like a heavy weight, yet he pushed the throttle forward and committed to the final chase. The German fighter's trail cut diagonally across the sky, a thin fading line of vapor tracing its attempt to outrun the Soviet ace. The aircraft maintained a steady climb in hopes of reaching the higher altitudes where its engine performed best and where its pilot believed he could outlast any pursuing enemy. But this time, the higher altitudes would not save him. Not with an opponent who had already proved he could fight all the way to the edge of the sky. Alexei narrowed his focus. His fatigue vanished beneath the sharpening of instinct and purpose. The Yak ascended behind the fleeing Mi-109 in a smooth, rising arc, gaining on it inch by inch. The German pilot looked back periodically, banking slightly left and right in a futile attempt to shake the pursuer. But each movement only confirmed a brutal reality. No matter the maneuver, the Yak held the line. It was closing the distance with quiet, unrelenting certainty. There is a moment in every battle when the outcome becomes inevitable, not because of firepower or machinery, but because one has outlasted the other. This was that moment. The German pilot's movements lost their aggressiveness. His turn softened. His once sharp climb mellowed into a shallow ascent. The fear that clung to him was subtle but unmistakable. He had realized he could not escape. Alexei brought the Yak to within 100 meters of the enemy's tail. The German fighter filled the center of his canopy, framed perfectly by the horizon. The Yak's engine howled under the final strain. Alexei leveled out, allowing the aircraft's nose to settle in a small, steady rise. This last victory came not from improvisation or reckless daring, but from discipline born of experience. The Yak's cannon unleashed a short, measured burst. Tracer rounds streaked forward, bright against the fading sky. 3 shells struck the German fighter's fuselage and wing root. The aircraft jerked violently to the right. A plume of smoke erupted, blossoming into a dark trail behind the crippled machine. For a moment it maintained its altitude, climbing stubbornly, as if refusing to accept its fate. Then the engine failed. The Me-109 rolled onto its right side and began a downward spiral. The descent was long, slow, and almost painfully quiet. It traced a black corkscrew of smoke through the distant sky, shrinking as it fell. The final German aircraft disappeared into the haze below, leaving nothing but a faint smudge of smoke drifting above the distant horizon. 7 enemy fighters. 12 minutes. The sky grew still at last. Alexei reduced power, letting the Yak settle into a shallow glide. The once violent battlefield became an expanse of profound silence. The engine hummed steadily, but its earlier roar had faded into a gentle, fatigued note. The air around him felt thin and cold. The late afternoon sun cast long bands of light across the cloud layer below, turning the distant haze into a pale, milky gold. For the first time since the engagement began, Alexei allowed himself to breathe deeply. The tension that had tightened every muscle slowly released, leaving behind an overwhelming heaviness. His hands trembled faintly on the control column. His heart still beat with the leftover rhythm of the fight. His mind drifted back through the last 12 minutes, a blur of violent maneuvers, sudden bursts of fire, rising and falling vectors, and the silent precision of decisions made in fractions of a second. He knew he had reached the limit of what a pilot and machine could endure together. Every calculation, every movement, every instinct had been sharpened by years of combat across the vast front. But no training could fully explain what had happened in that pocket of sky. Even he, the pilot at the center of the storm, struggled to grasp the full weight of it. Far below, Soviet ground forces continued their march. The German air threat had been neutralized entirely. The armor columns that had depended on those fighters for cover would advance without protection. The outcome of the ground battle had shifted in the span of minutes, not through strategy or artillery, but through the actions of a single pilot who refused to yield. Alexei angled the Yak toward home. The aircraft, battered but loyal, responded with a shuddering but steady turn. The sun dipped lower as he flew eastward, its lights stretching across the cockpit in a warm, fading glow. The sky began to shift from pale blue to the first hints of amber. The return flight was long enough for the reality of what had happened to settle into him. The exhaustion that washed over him was not merely physical. It was something deeper, a quiet recognition of the fragility of survival. 7 times in 12 minutes, the difference between life and death had been separated by inches, by fractions of seconds, by slivers of sky so narrow they barely counted as space at all. But with that recognition came something else. A sense of gratitude, a quiet, steady acknowledgement of the machine that had carried him, the training that had shaped him, and the comrades who depended on him. The sky had demanded everything from him, and yet it had given something back, the chance to return, to land, to survive another day. When Alexei descended through the lower cloud layer, the ground appeared beneath him in soft patches of white and gray. The air became warmer, thicker. The Yak felt heavier, but also calmer. The threat of combat had vanished. All that remained was the final task, bringing the aircraft home. He approached the airfield at a shallow angle. The runway stretched across the earth like a familiar path, guiding him towards safety. He aligned the Yak carefully, compensating for the damaged wing, adjusting for the pull of the worn engine. The landing was imperfect, but safe. The Yak touched down with a gentle pair of jolts before rolling to a slow, exhausted halt. When the engine finally shut down, the sudden silence struck him harder than the roar of battle. The absence of noise, of motion, of violence seemed unreal. He sat with his hands resting on the control column, feeling the quiet press in around him. The ground crew approached cautiously. They had seen aircraft return in terrible condition, but few had ever witnessed the aftermath of what Alexei had just endured. They saw the torn wingtip, the heat-scorched engine cowling, the smoldering smell of burned metal. They saw the spent cannon barrels and the faint trail of oil along the fuselage. They saw the exhaustion on his face. They did not yet know what had happened in the sky. Not yet, but they sensed the gravity of it. Alexei stepped onto the runway. The earth beneath him felt solid, unmoving. For the first time in hours, he felt weight. Not from the G-forces that had shaped his body through the fight, but from something deeper. The knowledge that he had witnessed and survived. One of the most extraordinary encounters of the air war. In the days that followed, the story spread through the regiment, then through the front, and later across the Allied air forces. 7 German fighters destroyed in 12 minutes. An engagement so intense, so mathematically improbable, that it seemed almost mythic. But those who studied the flight paths, the altitude charts, the gun camera footage, and the radio logs understood the truth. It was not a myth. It was not luck. It was the intersection of experience, instinct, discipline, and an unwavering refusal to yield. Years later, when historians looked back on the air war of the Eastern Front, they spoke of battles measured by miles, days, divisions, and brigades. But they always returned to the story of that 12-minute fight, the impossible geometry of one pilot against 7. They returned to the man who rose into the sky that day, not seeking glory, but answering a call that allowed others below to survive. And they remembered the final image, a Yak-9, battered but unbroken, gliding home through a quiet evening sky, carrying a pilot who had pushed himself beyond the limits of endurance and returned with a story the world would never forget.